One of the best ways to understand the impact hunting made on our country, both to the habitat and the animals, is to look at the story of the American buffalo. It's a complicated one, full of tremendous losses, but it also shows what can happen when mankind takes responsibility for protecting the world around him. Here at the National Bison Range in Montana, Stephen Rinella from the Netflix series MeatEater reveals the history between hunters and these iconic animals.
Hear that low, like that low grunt?
Yeah.
Like just watching this, right? You can imagine people observing groups. You couldn't understand the width. So instead of a band, you couldn't see the other end of it. But then it took 2 days to pass. I mean, I don't think, it didn't happen all the time, but like there were times when people would describe that and they would only understand how many there were when they later talked to someone who happened to be over there and was like, oh, I saw that too.
Wow.
And then it'd be like, oh, and you were 20 miles that way.
How many buffalo? Oh, about 2 days worth.
Yeah, 2 days.
2 days worth of buffalo.
And when you look in old history books, like when I was a kid, you'd always see 60 million. That was the number.
Yeah.
Like, oh, there once upon a time there were 60 million. And that came from observations like that. We're like, well, I saw them and Bob saw the same group and he was 10 miles away and it took 2 days to pass. So therefore there's that many here and there must be like that many there and that many there. And so we had 60 million. Now the fashionable number that gets thrown around is somewhere in the vicinity of 30 to 40 million. But it's helpful for people to hear about the tens of millions.
Yeah.
Because you can't understand it. It gets beyond human comprehension.
Tell us about that part of the history, what did that look like, going from tens of millions of buffalo to hundreds?
You might understand it if you look at it in phases. If you go back to the time of European colonization, when you had pioneers and settlers like gradually moving in, okay? So there were accounts of them as far east as Washington, D.C. Nashville, there are accounts of people seeing thousands around Nashville, okay? Those scattered smaller populations were largely wiped out by what we would now call like pot hunters. Like people you establish a settlement and everyone's living off wild meat and there's a finite resource and they're good at killing it and they kill it. Daniel Boone, who we know was, among other things, he was a buffalo hunter. George Washington killed them in his travels in the East, okay? So people would shoot them and eat them, right? Shoot them and use the hides for stuff. And then later, there became a industrial grade slaughter where it took maybe 100 years, right, to eliminate certain longitudinal bands of habitat. But then the industrial slaughter that came in the 1860s and 1870s was like nothing we'd ever seen. The railroads had reached the Great Plains, so you had a way to move mass quantities of things. You had well-developed eastern markets with urban people who needed resources and had money to buy it, and they wanted meat, and they wanted hides and other things, particularly hides, and there was applications for all manner of things, from blankets and coach robes to industrial belting, and you had a means to move it all because the railroads hit Dodge City. The minute railroads hit Dodge City, we emptied the southern plains. The minute the Northern Pacific moved across and like hit Miles City, we emptied the northern plains. And it just took on an industrial scale. That's really the only word to describe it. It was a systematic, industrialized slaughter of the animals because no one could understand the finiteness of the resource. By around 1882, east of here in Miles City, Montana, was the last big kill. And it took about that long to remove 15 million from the landscape. And by the end of the 1800s, when people were trying to gather up how many were left, they were literally trading letters. People were writing letters around the country. I've got 3, he has 2. I hear that this, where we're standing now, there's some number here. And you could count them up. Wow. You could count them up. People knew, and there were whistleblowers, right? There were whistleblowers and people knew, but generally like people couldn't comprehend it. They couldn't see what they were doing. They commented on how wasteful it was and people commented on how destructive it was, but the overall grand picture was no one really understood what they had done until it was too late. And then people in a popular sense knew that like, wow, we really blew this. And there were a handful of individuals who had some proximity to that process, right? Famous buffalo hunters who killed thousands of the animals develop some strange love for them in some way, because in the end, they grabbed a couple and kept them. It's hard to understand.
So the same people that are going out and hunting them are also the ones that say, like, I've grown to have an appreciation for this. We can't just...
There were a handful of key individuals that did that, and there were a handful of key individuals who had been crying out for decades to stop.
So if you were in that time, in that era, what would you have been doing?
I have little doubt that I would have probably engaged in the hunt, in the slaughter. I like to be outside. I like to hunt. I was too young to comprehend finiteness of resources. I wasn't raised with a conservation ethic. We behaved as though the wildlife resources fell from the sky.
Yeah.
And they were just here. Mm-hmm. God-given right? Just take all you want. There'll always be more. And I imagine if someone had told me that we could go out and make a bunch of money shooting buffalo out of Miles City, Montana, I would have been like, that sounds like a great idea.
Yeah.
I just have a feeling. I have a feeling that I would have been drawn to that with the same lack of context probably that a lot of the people that participated in it. And it's helpful to look and find evil. But when you get down to the details of people's lives who are involved in it, it's not as comforting.
Right.
It's oftentimes, it's like people who, they came out and they made a living doing one thing, and then that dried up and they made a living doing the next thing. And the Civil War ended. And you had all of these people you had the defeated Confederates, you had Union soldiers, you'd come into the military, you fought this war, you'd been roving around, you were a great shooter, you were great at camping, and all of a sudden, like, war's over.
Right.
And a lot of these guys just naturally drifted toward opportunity in the West. They didn't have anything. They're like poor kids.
Right.
Illiterate people that were like, I don't know, I heard you can make money doing this.
Yeah.
So you want to find that, like, it was these evil people doing this evil thing, and there was evil. There were evil players, but on whole, it was just people making mistakes. We're making them right now, right? We're making them right now, and in 100 years, they'll look at us, you and me, and they'll laugh about how stupid we were about something, right?
Yeah.
And we'll be like, yeah, I kind of knew. Single-use plastics. Like, I kind of was aware that there was a problem.
Right.
And in 100 years, I'll be like, what were those evil people doing? You'll be like, I was thirsty. I needed a drink.
Right.
I didn't know.
Yeah.
Kind of knew.
But then these same hunters, or at least a few of them, became part of the solution.
Yeah.
Like, what did that look like? How do we regain the amount that we have today?
I think let's say we take a key figure like Theodore Roosevelt, who's like a very key figure in preservation of the animal.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's a person who he's a city slicker, this like asthmatic, sickly city slicker child who was always very sort of embarrassed about his frailty and where he was from. And he wanted to have this swashbuckling Western lifestyle. And he discovered big game hunting. And his discovery of big game hunting fostered in him this like deep concern for wildlife that then he preserved about 50,000 acres for every day he was in office when he was in president. So it created in him an understanding and admiration and love for wildlife, and he played a part in the restoration and preservation of this animal, and he also killed a couple of them.
Yeah.
But something about the activity inspired in him a desire to keep it going. People will often ask, like when I wrote my book, American Buffalo, people are like, you love buffalo, like, but you killed one. I'm like, I reject the premise of your question. I reject the wording of your question. I wouldn't say but, I would say and.
Yeah.
It's not you loved it, but you loved it and you did. Because my view on it is like, there's a writer I admire a lot of his work, Jim Harrison. He talks about the predator husbands his prey, right? So if you grow up around animals and you eat animals and you live around animals and they become like your lifeblood, you develop a spiritual connection to wanting them to be around. You can just put it in purely pragmatic terms. If they're not there, we can't hunt.
Yeah.
And I'm like a hunter through and through.
Yeah.
So in my view is I want something that strikes people as being complicated, but it's not complicated. I want tons of animals everywhere, and I want regulated access to them.
Yeah.
It'd be the same thing as someone saying like, I want there to be beautiful beaches and I want to go to them.
Right.
Okay? It's like, it strikes me as very simple, but that's what I'm after.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the end goal. And we want to have access to the regulated resource. Because I think like that level of public buy-in and that level of advocacy, I'll tell you, wild turkeys, that's a very popular thing to hunt, okay?
Yeah.
3 million people hunt wild turkeys.
Yeah.
You don't mess with wild turkeys. You don't mess with them. You don't mess with deer. You don't mess with elk, right? You don't. Hell will come on you for messing with those things because there is enormous public support and they have cultural and economic value.
Yeah.
And the things that don't have cultural and economic value, you can get away with messing with them.
So you mentioned like regulation.
Regulated hunting.
I
yeah.
assume that costs dollars. Like, how does that? Who's providing these funds to make these regulations possible?
If you were to look historically, no user group has even approached the hunting and angling community in terms of conservation dollars spent on creating habitat and fueling our refuge system and fueling wildlife restoration.
Right.
So in a way, it was our responsibility to do it because like the legacy, I'm not talking like individuals, like, you know, I had relatives, they were still over in Italy when all this was going on. But culturally, right? Like as a culture, hunters, we decimated American wildlife. You know, everybody now is always celebrating deregulation. Operating in a deregulated atmosphere, when you could market stuff and sell it, we destroyed American wildlife. Everything, okay? We went from having turkeys in perhaps 39 states at the time of European contact to turkeys in 19 states. Now we harvest, like hunters kill more turkeys in Wisconsin every year than you probably had in the entire Midwest by the early 1900s.
Wow.
It was rebuilt by hunters. And I'm not saying like you know, hooray for us, we're so great. We caused the problem. We caused the problem, and then as a group, created mechanisms to rectify the situation. And we built funding structures around it. So when you buy guns, ammunition, boat gas, fishing equipment, archery equipment, there's a built-in tax on that stuff, 13 to 14% excise tax, which goes to the Wildlife Restoration Act, okay? That money specifically goes. When you want to hunt ducks, you buy a federal license and a state license. The federal license is now $25. That money is earmarked. Every year you buy it for $25, everyone that hunts ducks and geese, all of that money goes to wetlands habitat restoration and purchasing and preservation of wetlands habitat. So we, hunters, caused enormous destruction. And then we hunters said, if we want to keep doing this and want to be hunters and remain hunters, we have a lot of work to do. And we basically put hunting on hold for decades and rebuilt the things to the point where we, in some cases, over-rebuilt, okay? We now have turkey hunting seasons. Remember I said earlier at the time of European contact, we had turkeys in 39 states? There's turkey hunting seasons in 49 states. We went overboard and put them where they had never even been. We were so committed to rebuilding turkeys. What's peculiar about talking about this animal is this animal has a different history because this animal stopped existing as wildlife. And so we stopped perceiving it as wildlife. We stopped perceiving it as like a resource that individuals had access to. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but it just went on its own history. American wildlife has this path, say, and this animal, this particular animal has this weird little isolated journey as quasi-wildlife. Sort of livestocky, sort of wildlifey.
Right.
But it's as good as we can do.
So hunters were a part of the problem and a part of the solution.
People, largely men, walking around with guns, killed a lot of wildlife. A lot of it. And then put in motion some pretty extraordinary things to turn it around.
Yeah.
It's I really try to not view it in terms of villains and heroes. I think it was largely people kind of doing what they needed to do or had the luxury to do. You know.
This video is inspired by our PBS series, Reconnecting Roots. Visit reconnectingroots.com to watch the full episodes or to check out our music and podcast. Give us a thumbs up and subscribe so we can keep making more. Thanks for watching.